Hello again, this is the second part of my videos. The videos that I'm recording to produce a model analysis, in this case of a sentence employing it as an expletive pronoun, as in it surprises me that she has made it to the final. And as I was inviting you to go back to the definition that RAE produces in terms of verbs such as the one that we're discussing here, sorprender, which is a verb of afección psíquica, and what RAE points out of importance is that this section here. Si el sujeto es inanimado o es una oración y por tanto no puede ser concebido como agente directo de la acción, el complemento se considera indirecto y se usan los pronombres de dativo. Por ejemplo, a mi madre le asombra mi apetito. So when there is a change in the type of subject that we have in use, different from the subject that we were discussing a minute ago with the sentence Papá sorprendió a todos. In this case, the sentence that we are analyzing is an example of this second possibility that RAE postulates, in which case the subject of the sentence is not an agent such as Papá here, but rather is, in this case, a clause, a sentence, a subordinate clause, which is bracketed, that I'm bracketing here, que haya llegado a la final. This is the subject of the sentence that we are analyzing, a subject that is made up of a clause, una oración subordinada nominal. Why nominal? Because it can be replaced by the pronoun eso. Eso me sorprende. So, in this case, this oración subordinada nominal is performing the role of subject here. And is a type of subject, syntactic subject, that is no longer associated with the role of agent, the way Papá is associated with here, but rather the role of theme, right? As we talked about, in the theoretical presentation on this content. And there comes a second entity, nominal entity, me in this case, that we could replace by, for example, should we have a third person referent, we can have le sorprende instead of lo sorprende, right? Why? Because the subject is no longer agentive as Papá was in our previous example, but rather is a subject associated with the role of theme or tema. And here comes the employment of the clitic showing dative case that RAE explains is the case when the subject is inanimate or is a sentence, as in the case we are analyzing. So in this case we have a subject, a sentential subject, right? Syntactic subject, which is a sentence, a subordinate sentence, and a second argument, an indirect object, not a direct object, but an indirect object, whose role is also this, affected entity but realized syntactically by means of a dative pronoun and not an accusative one. We can understand that this is dative. Me is me when it is performing the function of direct object and when it is performing the function of indirect object. That's why the only possibility for us to distinguish that this pronoun here is performing the function of indirect object is by using a pronoun that points to a third person, singular or plural referent. So if we postulate that we're not speaking about ourselves, but we're speaking about a third person, and the person that was surprised, by this fact, then we will employ le, and in so doing, we will prove that this is no longer a direct object, but rather an indirect object for the representation of affected entity. And why is this type of pronoun, a dative pronoun, coming to the fore? Because of the type of subject that we have in use. A syntactic subject that is a subordinate sentence and that performs not the role of agent, but the role of theme instead. So here we have what I was just laying out in my other file. Me sorprende que hayas llegado a la final. Que hayas llegado a la final is the subject, syntactic subject, performing the role, semantic role of tema. And me is an indirect object performing the role, semantic role of entidad afectada. In this case, we can stipulate that sorprender is a predicate, the verbal predicate, that selects for two arguments or role players in using Pinker's terminology. A theme and an affected entity. Two arguments that I'm calling theme and affected entity. The theme is realized by means of this subject here, and the role of affected entity is realized by means of the dative pronoun me. So the same verb, sorprender, as you have, explained in the dictionary entry within RAE, can have two interpretations, two readings. One interpretation is the one that involves an agent and this agent produces this, psychic affectation, this affectedness, psychological affectedness on a patient. This is like the canonical realization of a transitive verb. Okay? Exemplified in our sentence, Papá sorprendió a todos. Papá agent, a todos, this entity that is affected and receives, this the effect of the action denoted by the verb sorprender carried out by an agent, in this case Papa. But in this second interpretation, we no longer have an agent, but rather we have an entity theme, this fact, the fact that somebody made it to the final, that causes the surprise, on an entity, but this entity in Spanish is no longer realized canonically as a direct object, but instead is realized as an indirect object. Okay? So, in Spanish, we can have transitive verbs that entail the presence of a subject plus an object or objects. For example, in the case of that, right? In the case of that, you have an agent, a subject that gives something, an entity given, right? Realized by means of a direct object, to a beneficiary or a recipient realized by means of an indirect object, right? So mamá le da el dinero a Susana. Mamá lo da a Susana. Mamá le da el dinero a Susana. What I'm trying to do here is employ the different clitics that signal the different functions that are involved, right? The agent is realized by means of mamá. El dinero is the entity given, performing the function of direct object, can be replaced by means of lo. And a Susana, indirect object realized by means of the clitic le, and also the prepositional phrase a Susana. Now, then we have intransitive verbs. Intransitive verbs that entail a subject plus a verb and no object. So, for example, I can say trabajo todos los días en la facultad. So, trabajar is an intransitive verb that only selects for an agent, which is what is understood to exist because of the inflectional features of the verb trabajo here, this morpheme o indicating that I'm making reference to a first person singular. And I don't have it, specified canonically by means of a noun phrase or a pronoun, because Spanish is a language that allows for the dropping of subjects, and therefore it is called pro-drop language when making reference to declarative sentences as this one. But of importance is to say that trabajar is a type of intransitive verb that selects for an agent. In contrast, there are other intransitive verbs that have the following realization: indirect object plus subject plus verb, as in me falta tiempo. What is this an instance of? A verb which is intransitive, faltar, but instead of being a verb that selects for one argument, an agent, as in trabajo todos los días en la facultad, what we have here is a verb that selects for more than an agent, a theme. And this second entity here, realized by me, we could have also had le, a ella le falta tiempo, for example. Called, let's call it experiencer. The experiencer of this, psychological process of lacking something. This is an intransitive verb of a different sort from the sort involved in trabajo todos los días, because it is not an agentive verb. Therefore, we have two types of intransitive verbs. Intransitive verbs that select for a subject, which is an agent, and are called an ergative, intransitive verbs. And then intransitive verbs that select for a subject, but also a different nominal constituent, but in the form of an indirect object. And this subject is never an agent, but more a theme. Therefore, these intransitive verbs are called unaccusative. Unaccusative verbs. Of importance here is that you associate that unaccusative verbs are non-agentive. Therefore, they do have a subject, but this subject is, as we have here specified, a theme, not an agent. And then they also select for another nominal constituent, apart from the subject, which tends to perform the syntactic function of indirect object, and semantically speaking tends to be associated with the role of experiencer. This that I have written out at the end here is what I would like you to associate with what we have here in Me sorprende que hayas llegado a la final. We can also understand that sorprender can be understood to be intransitive and accusative, for it selects for where is it? A theme that performs the syntactic function of subject, and an affected entity, an experiencer, that performs the syntactic function of indirect object. In any case, sorprender is, according to the obligatory constituents that it selects for, a two-place predicate, diádico, but of a different sort from the sort involved in Papá sorprendió a todos, in which case we have an agent and an affected entity that we're calling now experimentante, but different from sorprender, in the use of the sentence in question. In this case, what we have is sorprender used transitively in its canonical use, selecting for an agent and we can say experiencer. But of importance is that it is selecting for an agent. Okay? So, in this usage that we are analyzing, instead of having an agent, what we're having is a theme, a subject. And we have this other nominal constituent, this pronoun, me, that we can also replace by le, to indicate that this is an indirect object in terms of function, and it is signaling the affected entity or the experimentante or the experiencer of the situation denoted by the verb, the situation of causing surprise. So, what I say here is of importance. Se puede interpretar el verbo como transitivo, que requiere un sujeto agente y un objeto paciente, o podemos decir un objeto experimentante, como papá sorprendió a todos. Diádico, ¿por qué? Porque papá es un argumento, a todos es el otro. O se puede interpretar el verbo como intransitivo e inacusativo, como señalé aquí, intransitive and accusative verb, en el que el sujeto no es agente, que haya llegado a la final no es un agente, sino es un tema, y el objeto es un pronombre dativo, me, le, es decir, desempeña la función de objeto indirecto, que él cumple el papel semántico que llamaremos aquí entidad afectada, o podemos decir, como estamos desarrollando ahora, experimentante. El grado del predicado sería, de todas formas, diádico también, pero con distintos tipos de argumentos. Sobre todo la diferencia está en que en la oración de papá tenemos a un agente y en la oración de nuestro ejemplo no tenemos agencia, sino que tenemos un tema como sujeto. Por eso podemos arguir que estamos frente a un verbo que se llama intransitivo e inacusativo, intransitive and accusative verb, that are by their very nature, that is, by its very nature, non-agentive. And this is the usual sequence that we find when these verbs are involved in Spanish: an indirect object, a subject, and the verb. For example, this other example sentence: me o le falta tiempo. Now, what we have in English is, it surprises me that he or she has made it to the final. This is my looking up of the word final, just to be sure that I was using it correctly. So, it surprises me that he or she has made it to the final. Again, what we have as verbal predicate that functions as predicator in English is the same verb that we have detected for Spanish, surprise. Right? So surprise is also, like Spanish, to place. Is a to place predicate. right? But we can unequivocally call it transitive in English. But similarly to Spanish, what we say is that the subject, which is also a clause, so it's a two-place predicate that selects for a subject. A subject is a clausal subject. And this clausal subject performs the role of theme, like Spanish. This clause, this clausal subject, is, as you can see, that he or she has made it to the final, is a nominal that clause. A clausal subject that performs the semantic role of theme. And also a direct object, not an indirect object like Spanish, but a direct object that is a pronoun, surprises me, that performs the role of affected entity or experiencer, rather. Okay? Then we can see that the roles played are the same, because we also have a theme and an experiencer in Leo, me sorprende que hayas llegado a la final. It surprises me that he or she has made it to the final. Theme, experiencer, also present. The thing is that we call this me in Spanish an indirect object, and that's why this employment of a dative pronoun gives us room to determine that we're dealing with an intransitive and accusative verb that selects for an indirect object and the subject other than the verb. In contrast, in English, while we have the same semantic roles of theme and experiencer involved, what we deal with is a subject, syntactically speaking, and a direct object, not indirect object, syntactically speaking. Now, in terms of type of subject in English, we call it an extraposed subject. We don't use the term extraposition in Spanish, but we use it for English only. And this extraposed subject that he or she has made it to the final, located at the end of the sentence, is in use in conjunction with the employment of it as an expletive pronoun that fills in the canonical preverbal subject position that is left empty when the notional subject is moved towards the end of the sentence and is thus extraposed. So it is an expletive pronoun, that is to say, it is not an argument of surprise. It is explained in terms of the syntax of the language in question, that is to say, English, and it's being a non-prodrop language, which requires the employment of a grammatical subject, an expletive pronoun, it in this case, when the predicate functioning as predicator does not select for one argument, does not select for any argument, for that matter, for any argument, as in rain, when you have it rains, so it is in use together with verbs such as rain that select for no argument whatsoever, and also employed it, in this case, when the predicate functioning as predicator does select for an argumental subject, as in our case in this example, but the latter is extraposed, as in our example, for information packaging reasons, therefore in association with the principle of heaviness and abiding by the principle of end weight that establishes that heavy constituents that are longer and structurally more complex than noun phrases be located at the end of sentences. So, recapping a little bit. Here we see the extraposition of the notional subject in this sentence, that he or she has made it to the final. This is a clause. This is a heavy constituent. Therefore, it calls for its being located at the end of the sentence, where heavy constituents usually get to be located. This extraposition of the notional subject, notional meaning argumental, that it is selected for by the predicate, verbal predicate in use, in this case, surprise, causes a space here, causes, a position to be left empty. Which is this position? The position of the canonical preverbal subject position. We're speaking about English, right? Canonical. When the notional, the argumental subject is extraposed, then there's a position left empty in the canonical preverbal position that we associate with simple declarative sentences in English. Thus, this position is filled in, it cannot be left empty, and it is filled in by the expletive pronoun it. Okay? So, as we can see, we have sorprender, choosing, selecting for a theme and an experiencer, and we have surprise, selecting for a theme and an experiencer too. So semantically speaking, there is correspondence in terms of the type of predicate functioning as predicator. However, there is non-correspondence regarding the type of verb involved in each language. We're going to consider it intransitive and accusative in Spanish, and transitive in English. So this means that in Spanish we have a subject, a nominal performing the role of subject, and an indirect object, and in English we have a nominal performing the role of subject and another nominal performing the role of direct object. And also, there is also non-correspondence, correspondence regarding the syntax of the sentence, and insofar as English shows the use of an expletive pronoun, filling in the canonical preverbal subject slot that is left empty with the extra position of the notional, meaning argumental subject. Let me see if this is well written so that you can have a good model. So semantically, there's correspondence in terms of the type of predicate functioning as predicator. So it's sorprender, surprise, the two predicates in use functioning as predicators respectively are to place predicates, right? However, there is non-correspondence regarding the type of verb involved in each language. We can postulate that in Spanish, we are before an instance of an intransitive and accusative verb because of the reasons that I explained before, that intransitive and accusative verbs can never be agentive and that they select, other than a subject, an indirect object. And it is still transitive in English, because we speak in English of the presence of a subject and a direct object, me here. And there's also non-correspondence regarding the syntax of the sentence insofar as English shows the use of an expletive pronoun, which is in this case it, filling in the canonical preverbal subject slot. Let's use capitals there, subject slot, left empty with the extra position of the notional or argumental subject. So this it here fills in the canonical preverbal subject slot that we have in all sentences, declarative sentences in English, that is left empty when there occurs the extra position, the movement towards the end of the notional, argumental, because it is selected for by the semantics of surprise, it is the theme, subject, which is in turn, well, I was going to say this, that in turn this subject that is extraposed in English is a heavy constituent because it is a clause, therefore it is much heavier than, it's different from a noun phrase. And this is the case in the two languages because we have a heavy constituent in the form of a clause both in Spanish and in English. So here there's also correspondence. So we see that even though there's the employment of a post-verbal subject, right, que hayas llegado a la final, and an extra post subject that he or she has made it to the final. So I should add this. This is a sujeto postverbal, even though we have a postverbal subject in Spanish, and what is the same in this case for our analytical purposes, an extra post subject in English, because the two are heavy constituents, because the two are a clause, right? And the two of them are located at the end of the sentence. We speak of post-verbal subject in Spanish, and we speak of extra post subject in English, even though this is also room for, the two sentences being correspondent. In English, we see the employment of it to fill in this slot left empty by the extra position of the subject, something which does not occur in Spanish. There's no need in Spanish to employ an expletive pronoun here at the beginning of the sentence here when the notional or argumental subject is used post-verbally. So there's room for establishing both correspondence, not only in terms of the semantics of the predicates functioning as predicators, but also in terms of the employment of, respectively, a postverbal subject in Spanish and an extra post subject in English. But there is at the same time room for establishing non-correspondence with two features in mind. The first feature is the possibility of considering the verb intransitive in Spanish, but of the unagentive, non-agentive type. It is an unaccusative verb, so non-agentive type, and transitive all the same in English, for we still speak of the employment of a direct object, which is the typical constituent that emerges in transitive patterns in English. And also room for non-correspondence regarding the obligatory use of an expletive pronoun in English, it, that emerges as a consequence of the extra position of the notional subject, and the absence of such obligation in Spanish, even when the argumental subject has also been moved to the end of the sentence and has been located post-verbally. What you can try to do now is produce the paragraph that, puts this information in order. But this is what is crucial information for you to consider when analyzing these two forms. The one in green here, green and yellow, and the counterpart in English here. I will take out the highlighting here so that you can see that we're considering this. Me sorprende que hayas llegado a la final, and it surprises me that he or she has made it to the final. When producing the analysis of these two sentences, what you are to put in order is this last bit of information that I included at the very end of this model analysis. Thank you very much.